Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. The person I turned to for help at the last moment offered me a deal I couldn't even imagine. We met at a cafe on the corner of the street, an ordinary, unremarkable place where no one would pay attention to us. He showed up just in time, as if he knew that I was ready for my decision, although I didn't admit it to myself. Victor was dressed strictly and tastefully. His manners were captivating with calmness and confidence. When he came in, I was already sitting at the table, desperately trying not to look too tense. A hurricane of emotions raged inside me, but outwardly I maintained an appearance of composure. He sat down opposite me, slowly ordered coffee, and without taking his eyes off me began to discuss the terms. "Laura," his voice was low but penetrating, "do you realize that the situation is serious? I've offered you a way out. There won't be another one." I was silent, staring at my trembling hands. I have never cheated on my husband in 14 years of marriage. My mind seemed to turn to stone, refusing to believe in what was happening. Just a few days ago, I was on the verge of financial disaster, and now I'm being offered a deal that will ruin not only my life but everything that was dear. But despite the horror that held me down, I felt that there was nowhere to retreat. What would that mean? My voice was trembling treacherously, but I had to ask. Victor leaned forward slightly, as if to make it clear that this would be our shared secret. His gaze became even more piercing. "It's just business, Laura. There are no obligations. No one will know. You'll get your money and I'll get mine. It will be fast and safe." He said the last words with a slight accent on each, as if emphasizing that there was nothing terrible about it. "I need to think about it," I managed to say, even though I knew it was an empty excuse. Victor looked at me with a slight smile, in which I caught a hint of his confidence in the outcome of our conversation. He straightened up, sipped his coffee, and slowly put a business card on the table. "You have exactly 24 hours, he said, getting up from his seat. "I know you will make the right choice." When Victor left, I sat in place for a long time, trying to come to my senses. A business card with his name and phone number was in front of me, as a reminder that now I was at a dead end. I took it with trembling fingers and put it in my purse, hoping that this would help hide the very reality of what was happening from myself. I spent the whole evening in a foggy state. She performed the usual actions on the machine. She cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, helped Tom with his homework. Michael came home from work late, tired, but still kissed me on the cheek with his usual kindness and said something about how hard his day had been. I was barely listening to him, still trying to process what had just happened. Victor followed me like a shadow in my thoughts. I tossed and turned in bed for a long time at night. My thoughts went back to that moment in the cafe when Victor calmly and confidently offered me a deal. He wanted me to sleep with him for paying part of my debt. Over and over again, I tried to consider other ways out of the situation, but each time I came up against the same thing. I needed the money urgently, and I had no other way to get it. The next morning, I sent my son to school and, barely waiting for Michael to leave for work, picked up the phone. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like its beats could be heard all over the house. I dialed the number several times, but I still didn't dare press the call button. The fear was unbearable, but even more terrifying was not the action, but the inaction. Finally, I clenched my teeth and pressed the button. "Yes, Laura?" Victor's voice on the other end of the line was calm and confident, just like that night in the cafe. "I agree," I whispered, barely holding back tears. "All right," was his short reply. "We'll meet tonight. Everything will be as I said." He named the time and place, and I automatically wrote them down in a notebook. When the conversation ended, I sat for a long time staring into space. My hands were shaking, and a storm was raging inside me. I knew I had made a decision that would change everything. But at that moment, it seemed to me that I simply had no other choice. I spent the whole day in a daze. Every action was mechanical, every thought was only about the evening, which was approaching with frightening inevitability. I tried not to think about what would happen next. I couldn't imagine the details. I just knew I had to do it, otherwise everything I had built with Michael and Tom would collapse. When evening came, I dressed as if I were going to a regular meeting. Michael was at home, but I told him I was going to work. We had an urgent project that required my participation. He nodded without asking any questions. This moment, when I deceived him so easily, was the last warning for me. But it was too late to change anything. I arrived at the meeting place, a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, which Victor had talked about on the phone. Everything inside me froze, as if I had become cold and insensitive. I entered the hotel, called the number that Victor had given me, and went up to the floor. The door was ajar. I took a deep breath and went in. Victor was there, still as calm and confident as ever. He gave me a curt nod, pointing to a chair next to the bed. "It's going to be quick, Laura. You can handle it." I didn't answer. At that moment, I felt not alive, but a puppet who was being manipulated without her will. Time seemed to have stopped, and everything that was happening was losing its meaning for me. It was like a nightmare from which you can't wake up. When it was over, Victor silently left a piece of paper on the table with new figures, an updated amount of debt, where the interest was significantly reduced. He left without saying another word. I stayed in the room feeling empty. I saw my reflection in the mirror, a woman I no longer recognized. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, trying to figure out what I had done. It all started with one call. With trembling hands, I dialed the number that my friend had given me with a warning, "Be careful, Laura, it's not for nothing." Victor answered immediately, as if he was waiting for my call. His voice was calm, even slightly cold, as if he knew he had the full advantage in our conversation. "Yes, I'm listening," he said, as if he already knew what I was going to ask. "I need to talk." My words sounded uncertain, as if I didn't fully believe that I was really going to do this. "I'll meet you tomorrow at the cafe on the corner of Washington and 5th. His tone was matter of fact, without unnecessary emotion. "At 12. He hung up the phone, leaving me sitting in silence. No questions, no clarifications. He just accepted the fact that I was coming. And now I had no choice, I had to go. The next day I felt like I was on pins and needles. The morning passed in a fog. Breakfast, Tom's packing for school, saying goodbye to Michael. He didn't seem to notice anything, although he was usually very attentive to my mood. I tried to convince myself that this was just another ordinary day. But the thought of meeting Victor did not leave me for a second. When I entered the cafe, Victor was already waiting for me. He was sitting at a table by the window, as if watching everyone who came in. His presence was as casual as his voice on the phone. I noticed that he was well dressed, a business suit, a perfectly pressed shirt, an elegant watch. He looked like he was in control of everything and everyone around him. I went to the table and sat down opposite. Victor looked up, which had something alarming in it, a mixture of curiosity and a slight grin. He motioned for me to order something, but I just shook my head. My throat was dry and I couldn't bring myself to say a word. "So you really need the money?" Victor finally said, breaking the silence. His tone was as calm and confident as before. "Yes," I replied, trying not to meet his eyes. "How much?" I named an amount that made me feel even more vulnerable. Victor nodded slightly, as if considering something. His gaze seemed to shine through me, assessing every movement, every emotion. "I can help," he finally said, pausing to emphasize the importance of his words. "But do you understand that everything has its price?" "What do you mean?" I asked, although I already guessed what it was going to be about. Victor leaned closer, his voice becoming a little quieter but no less insistent. "You will have to make certain commitments. It won't be as easy as it seems." I tensed, feeling anxiety rising inside me. Something in his voice, in the way he spoke, made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. But I couldn't back down, there was too much at stake. "I'm ready," I managed, although I wasn't sure what I was saying. Victor leaned back in his chair, pleased with my answer. "We will meet again and then we will discuss the details. But remember, Laura, this is not just a deal. You have to be prepared for the consequences." Those words sent a chill through me. Victor didn't say anything specific, but I knew that his offers would go beyond the usual loan. A storm of emotions raged inside me, fear, anxiety, but also a strange sense of inevitability. I couldn't stop. He took a business card from the inside pocket of his jacket and put it in front of me. "My contacts are here. We'll get in touch. Now go home, Laura, and think about what's really important." I took the card without saying another word. I got up and headed for the exit, feeling Victor's eyes burning into my back. I went outside and the cold air hit me in the face. The world around him seemed too bright, too real after everything that had happened. All the way home I tried to sort out my feelings, but every time I ran into a wall. Victor offered me a solution, but at what cost? And was I willing to do this to save my life? These questions plagued me all evening as I sat alone, trying to find answers that might not have existed. When night descended on the city, I already knew that there was no turning back. I accepted Victor's challenge, and now I had to accept his terms, whatever they were. It had been a few days since that meeting with Victor, but I still couldn't get his words out of my head. His every look, every movement floated in my mind like shadows that cannot be removed. I knew I was on the edge. the border beyond which I will not be able to return to my old life. One evening, when Michael was late at work again, I was left alone in our house. Tom was already asleep, and in the silence of the house I could hear my heart beating loudly. I had to make up my mind. I had to choose which way to go next. I knew that I needed to meet with Victor again and find out exactly what he would offer me in return. But the fear of what might happen held me down. Suddenly the phone rang. I shuddered and looked at the screen. It was him, Victor. My mind was flooded with anxiety, but I knew I couldn't ignore this call. Yes, I managed when I picked up the phone. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the evening. Riverside Hotel, room 312. We'll discuss the details on the spot. Victor's voice was as confident and calm as last time. He didn't give me time for questions or doubts, he just hung up on me. I looked at the phone as if it was the source of all my pain, and then slowly put it down on the table. Tomorrow. The word echoed in my head, giving the whole thing a sense of inevitability. The next day I spent the whole day in a strange daze. I tried not to think about the upcoming meeting, but it was impossible. Every movement, every word seemed empty and meaningless. It seemed that life itself had stopped and was waiting for the moment when I would see Victor again. When evening came, I prepared carefully. Dressed in a simple but elegant dress, I tried to look calm and confident. Michael was at home and I told him that I had business in the city. He just nodded without asking any questions and went back to his work papers. I felt a slight twinge of guilt, but it quickly disappeared. Too many thoughts were occupying my head at that moment. I got to the Riverside Hotel by parking my car nearby. Stopping at the entrance, I looked at the tall building towering over the street. It seemed somehow alien and hostile to me. Something inside me told me that I was making a huge mistake, but I suppressed these feelings. Taking a deep breath, I headed inside. Victor was waiting for me in room 312 as promised. When I entered, he met me with a calm look and motioned for me to sit in the chair opposite. The room was cozy, but there was a cold formality in it that immediately made me tense up. There was no place for warmth or security here, only for business negotiations that were supposed to determine my future. Laura, I'm glad you came, he began as soon as I sat down. I understand that you are nervous, but it is natural. All I want is to offer you the opportunity to solve your problems. The only question is how ready you are for this. His words sounded calm, even ordinary, but inside I was seething with anxiety. I could hardly focus on his voice because there were thousands of questions in my head that had no answers. What exactly are you suggesting? I finally managed to say, trying to sound confident, although my voice was trembling treacherously. Victor leaned forward, his eyes serious and attentive. I offer you the opportunity to repay your debt in a non-standard way. We won't go into details now, but the bottom line is that it should be confidential. No one will know unless you want them to. I guarantee complete anonymity. I felt something heavy settle in my stomach. I guessed it would be a difficult deal, but I still wasn't ready to hear it in such a direct way. And if I refuse? I asked, although I knew it would be difficult to refuse him. Then Laura, you'll have to find other ways to pay. But I doubt that you have such opportunities. His voice was firm, but without a trace of threat, just a statement of fact. I froze for a moment, torn between fear and necessity. I tried to imagine what it would be like to live knowing that I had made this choice. But what scared me even more was the thought that I could lose everything if I refused. Michael, Tom, our home, our future, it all seemed too fragile to risk. What do I need to do? I asked as if I had finally accepted my fate. Victor nodded as if confirming the correctness of my decision. We'll meet a few more times. Nothing complicated, nothing that could harm you. Everything will remain between us. I will provide you with the exact conditions later, but believe me, everything will be extremely simple. His words sounded convincing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was playing with fire. A feeling of anxiety flared up inside me, but I couldn't stop. All I could do was hope that the consequences would not be devastating. When our meeting came to an end, Victor stood up and held out his hand to me. I shook it mechanically, feeling the cold of his fingers. He walked me to the door and before I left he said, Laura, remember that I'm always in touch. If you have any questions or doubts, just call. We'll do it together. I nodded, unable to answer, and left the room. In the hallway, I paused for a moment, trying to put my thoughts in order. Everything that had happened in those few minutes seemed unreal. I was standing on the edge of the abyss, but I already knew that it was impossible to take a step back. When I left the hotel, night covered the city, and I felt a cold wind blowing across my face. There was still chaos inside me, but the decision had been made. I had entered this world with my head, and now I had to find a way not to drown in its depths. It's been a few weeks since I first crossed a line that I couldn't go back from. Meetings with Victor became a new reality for me, but, strangely enough, this period did not change my life externally. Everything remained the same, or at least that's what it seemed at first glance. Every morning I woke up in our cozy house, where everything was so perfect that sometimes it seemed unreal. Michael was there, caring and attentive as always. He didn't notice my inner turmoil because I had learned to hide my feelings under a mask of calmness. Tom, our son, was the same cheerful and carefree boy he always was. Nothing had changed in his world, and that gave me strength. But inside I was in chaos. Every time I looked at Michael, I felt a weight that was getting heavier every day. Every time I saw Tom, something broke inside me. How could I betray my family for the sake of luxury, for the sake of a familiar standard of living? But now it was an inevitable part of my being, and I had to learn to live with it. The morning began, as always, with a cup of strong coffee and the smell of freshly baked bread. I tried to maintain the usual rituals that helped me maintain the illusion of normality. Michael left for work, kissing me goodbye, and I was left alone in an empty house. There was another day ahead, full of worries and thoughts about how to keep everything I have. I took my bag and went to the city. My way lay through the same shops where I had spent so much time before. I couldn't get rid of the desire to plunge back into the world of shopping, where everything seemed so easy and simple. I knew I couldn't afford it, but the shopping habit was still strong. The first point on my route was a boutique on the corner of the main street. I walked past the window and noticed a new dress that would be perfect for the party Michael and I were invited to next week. My hand automatically reached for the door handle, but I stopped myself. No, you can't. I couldn't afford another expense, knowing what might follow. But everything inside me screamed that I deserved it. That I've been through too much and I'm entitled to a little joy. My mind resisted, but I went into the store anyway. The saleswoman recognized me and smiled warmly. "Laura, it's good to see you. We have a new arrival today. Would you like to take a look?" Her voice was as warm as ever. I nodded, feeling a burning desire inside me to plunge back into this world where everything is subject to my whims. We went to the fitting room and I took the dress from the hanger. It was quiet and peaceful inside the fitting room. I looked at myself in the mirror, as if I had become the woman I was before all this. The dress fit perfectly, emphasizing every line of my body. But with that came the realization. I looked at my reflection and saw a stranger in front of me. The one who led a double life, hiding the truth behind a perfect facade. I knew that this dress was not just a thing, but a symbol of everything that I could not give up. And at the same time, it reminded me of how far I had come. I took off the dress and returned it to the hanger, thanking the saleswoman. She looked disappointed but didn't say anything. When I left the store I felt better. I could still control myself. She could still make the right choice even if it was a painful one. As the day went on, I tried to take my mind off what had happened in recent weeks. I met with my friends, talked about trifles, trying not to betray my inner doubts. We were sitting in a cafe, chatting about fashion, travel and family, and I felt like a part of this world again. But it all seemed superficial, as if something deeper and darker was hiding behind the facade. When I got home, Michael was already there. He was in a good mood, offered to spend the evening together and even offered to cook dinner. I watched him as he worked in the kitchen, and I realized that this moment was one of those that I most appreciated in our lives. The simplicity and sincerity that I had always loved in Michael now seemed unattainable to me. He was close but at the same time so far away. After dinner we were sitting on the couch and Michael started talking about our weekend plans. He wanted to spend time with Tom, have a picnic in the park or go out of town. I smiled, nodding at his suggestions, but a feeling of unease grew inside me. Everything seemed perfect, but I knew it was just an illusion. Michael was happy, but how long can I keep up this lie? When Tom fell asleep, Michael offered to watch a movie, but I refused, citing fatigue. He kissed me on the cheek and went into the living room. I was left alone in our bedroom, feeling the weight of these weeks hanging over me. I felt trapped in a trap that I had created myself. Lying in the dark, I tried to force myself to sleep, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. Past meetings with Victor, paying off debts, all this has now become a part of my past which I could not forget. But every day it became more and more significant. I didn't know how much more I could take. I reached the point where returning to the usual luxury no longer brought the same pleasure. Everything that once seemed important was now meaningless. The next day I woke up with the feeling that something had changed. The world around me was still the same, but something inside me had broken. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know how to find a way out. I understood that my choice had already been made, and now I have to live with its consequences. But how long can I pretend that everything is okay? This question haunted me, and the answer to it seemed increasingly unclear. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.